Ukraine and Russia share a long and complicated history. The two nations have been intertwined for centuries. Both trace their roots back to the East Slavic civilization. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, was a major center of power in the early medieval period. This era saw the rise of the Kievan Rus, a vast East Slavic state. Over time, the territories of modern-day Ukraine and Russia diverged. Ukraine faced periods of rule by various powers, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Despite these shifts in power, Ukraine's cultural and linguistic identity remained distinct. The 20th century brought about a new set of challenges. Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, experiencing both periods of relative prosperity and immense hardship. The Holodomor, a devastating famine engineered by Stalin's regime, remains a dark chapter in Ukrainian history. Despite the tumultuous past, Ukraine emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 as an independent nation. This marked a pivotal moment. It ushered in an era of self-determination for Ukraine. However, it also laid the groundwork for future tensions with Russia. The shared history and intertwined destinies of these two nations would continue to shape their relationship for years to come. The years leading up to the 2022 invasion were marked by escalating tensions. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 sent shockwaves through the region. This event signaled a willingness to use military force to achieve geopolitical goals. The annexation was widely condemned by the international community. The conflict in eastern Ukraine, simmering since 2014, further fueled the flames of discord. Russia-backed separatists clashed with Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region. This conflict created a humanitarian crisis. It displaced millions and claimed thousands of lives. As the situation in eastern Ukraine deteriorated, Russia began a massive military buildup along its border with Ukraine. This display of force raised alarms across the globe. Western governments warned of an imminent invasion. Diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation proved futile. Amidst the heightened tensions, Russia issued a series of demands. These included a guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO. Russia also sought to limit NATO's military presence in Eastern Europe. These demands were seen as non-starters by the West. They were seen as an infringement on Ukrainian sovereignty and NATO's open-door policy. The stage was set for a confrontation. The world watched with bated breath as diplomacy faltered and the drums of war grew louder. In the midst of the escalating conflict in eastern Ukraine, a glimmer of hope emerged with the Minsk agreements. These agreements, brokered in 2014 and 2015, aimed to bring an end to the fighting and find a peaceful resolution. The first Minsk Protocol, signed in September 2014, called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weaponry and constitutional reforms in Ukraine to grant greater autonomy to the Donbas region. However, the ceasefire proved fragile. Violations were rampant. The agreement failed to fully address the underlying issues fueling the conflict. The second Minsk agreement, signed in February 2015, sought to build on its predecessor. It outlined a more comprehensive roadmap for peace. This included provisions for local elections in the Donbas, amnesty for those involved in the fighting, and the restoration of Ukrainian control over its eastern border. Prague and Germany played significant roles in facilitating the Minsk agreements. They engaged in shuttle diplomacy, working tirelessly to bridge the divide between Ukraine and Russia. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President François Hollande invested considerable political capital in the peace process. They sought to find common ground and prevent a wider conflict. Despite their best efforts, the Minsk agreements ultimately failed to achieve their intended goal of lasting peace. The agreements were plagued by ambiguity. They were open to different interpretations by the parties involved. This lack of clarity contributed to the ongoing stalemate. The Minsk agreements, while representing a valiant effort to avert a larger war, ultimately served as a prelude to a more devastating conflict. The days leading up to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine were a tense and uncertain time. The world watched with bated breath as diplomatic efforts faltered and military activity escalated. On February 21, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered a speech that sent shockwaves across the globe. In his address, he recognized the independence of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine, entities widely seen as Russian proxies. This recognition was a clear violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It was condemned by the international community as a dangerous escalation of the conflict. In the wake of Putin's announcement, Russian troops, already massed along Ukraine's borders, began to move into the Donbas region. This move further fueled fears that a full-scale invasion was imminent. Despite the escalating tensions, diplomatic efforts continued in a desperate attempt to avert war. World leaders engaged in frantic phone calls with Putin, urging him to de-escalate the situation and choose diplomacy over conflict. However, these pleas fell on deaf ears. The world watched in horror as, on February 24, 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The invasion marked a turning point in European history. It shattered the illusion of peace that had prevailed on the continent since the end of the Cold War. Section 5. Retreat from Kyiv, a strategic maneuver. In the early days of the invasion, Russian forces made rapid advances towards the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. The city, home to nearly 3 million people, braced for a siege. Ukrainian resistance, however, proved fiercer than anticipated. Russian forces faced logistical challenges and unexpectedly strong opposition from Ukrainian defenders. As the fighting raged on, a glimmer of hope emerged from an unexpected quarter. Turkey, a NATO member with close ties to both Russia and Ukraine, offered to mediate talks between the warring parties. Negotiations took place in Istanbul, focusing on key issues such as a ceasefire, humanitarian corridors, and the status of disputed territories. While the talks did not result in a breakthrough agreement, they did pave the way for a significant development: Russia's decision to withdraw its troops from the Kyiv region. This unexpected move was initially hailed as a victory for Ukraine and a sign that Russia was reconsidering its objectives. However, it soon became clear that the withdrawal was a strategic maneuver rather than a genuine concession. Russia's military leadership announced that they were shifting their focus to the eastern Donbas region, where they aimed to achieve a decisive victory. The withdrawal from Kyiv allowed Russian forces to regroup, resupply, and redeploy to the east. It also exposed the brutality of the conflict as evidence of atrocities committed by retreating Russian troops emerged from towns and villages around Kyiv. Section 6. 3 years of conflict, a war of attrition. The conflict in Ukraine has now raged for over 3 years, evolving into a grueling war of attrition. Both sides have dug in, fortifying their positions and engaging in relentless artillery duels. The front lines, stretching for hundreds of miles, have remained largely static, with neither side able to make significant territorial gains. Key battles have been fought in strategic locations across the country. The eastern city of Severodonetsk, a major industrial center, witnessed some of the fiercest fighting of the war. After months of intense combat, Russian forces captured the city, but at a heavy cost. The southern port city of Mariupol, a vital economic hub, was besieged for weeks, enduring relentless bombardment. The city's fall to Russian forces in May 2022 marked a significant, albeit costly, victory for Russia. Despite the stalemate, both sides have made incremental territorial gains. Russia has consolidated its control over the Donbas region, capturing key cities and towns. Ukraine, bolstered by Western military aid, has launched counter-offensives, reclaiming some territory in the south and east. The conflict has exacted a heavy toll on both nations. Millions have been displaced from their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries or within Ukraine itself. The war has had a devastating impact on Ukraine's economy and infrastructure. Cities and towns lie in ruins. Hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure have been targeted. The human cost of the conflict is immeasurable. Thousands of civilians have been killed, and the true extent of the casualties may not be known for years to come. Section 7. The crossroads: peace or continued conflict. As the war in Ukraine enters its 4th year, the world grapples with the question of what the future holds. Will the conflict continue indefinitely, or is a negotiated settlement within reach? The path forward remains uncertain, with 2 starkly different scenarios emerging. The first and most hopeful scenario is a negotiated peace. This would require significant concessions from both sides, a willingness to compromise on core interests and a commitment to finding a lasting solution. International pressure, particularly from key players like the United States and China, could play a crucial role in bringing the warring parties to the negotiating table. However, numerous obstacles stand in the way of peace. Deep-seated mistrust, conflicting narratives, and the high stakes involved make finding common ground a formidable challenge. Russia's demands, which include Ukrainian neutrality and recognition of its territorial gains, remain unacceptable to Ukraine and its Western allies. The second and more pessimistic scenario is a protracted conflict. This would entail continued fighting, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The war would likely settle into a grinding stalemate, with intermittent flare-ups and a constant risk of escalation. A protracted conflict would have devastating consequences for Ukraine, Russia, and the wider world. It would further destabilize the region, exacerbate global food and energy crises, and deepen divisions between Russia and the West. The choice between peace and continued conflict ultimately rests with the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. The international community has a responsibility to support all efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful resolution while providing Ukraine with the means to defend itself. The stakes are high and the consequences of failure are dire. Section 8, Predicting the Future, an AI perspective. Predicting the future is a complex and uncertain endeavor, even for advanced artificial intelligence. However, by analyzing vast amounts of data, identifying patterns, and assessing probabilities, AI can offer valuable insights into potential outcomes. Based on current trends and historical precedents, the outlook for the war in Ukraine remains highly unpredictable. Factors suggesting a continuation of the conflict include entrenched positions. Both sides have dug in, both literally and figuratively. They have invested heavily in fortifications and manpower, making significant territorial gains unlikely. Unwavering resolve. Public opinion in both Russia and Ukraine remains firmly against concessions. This makes it politically difficult for leaders to compromise, even if it means prolonging the war. External support. Both Ukraine and Russia receive support from external actors, providing them with military and economic lifelines. This external involvement reduces the incentive for either side to seek a negotiated settlement. Factors suggesting a potential for peace include war fatigue. The longer the conflict drags on, the greater the economic and human cost for both sides. This could eventually create pressure for a negotiated solution, even if it involves painful compromises. International pressure. Key global players, such as the United States, China, and the European Union, have a vested interest in ending the war. Increased diplomatic efforts and economic incentives could sway the parties towards peace. Leadership change. A change in leadership in either Kiev or Moscow could create an opportunity for a reset in relations and a fresh approach to negotiations. Ultimately, the future of the war in Ukraine hinges on the decisions and actions of key actors, both within and outside the region. AI can provide valuable insights, but it cannot predict the future with certainty. Section 9, Conclusion, a legacy of uncertainty. The war in Ukraine, a conflict born from a complex web of historical grievances, geopolitical rivalries, and miscalculations, has cast a long shadow over the world. It has shattered the illusion of peace in Europe, tested the limits of international cooperation, and inflicted immeasurable suffering on millions of lives. As the conflict enters its fourth year, the path ahead remains shrouded in uncertainty. The possibility of a negotiated peace, while distant, remains a flicker of hope in the darkness. However, the potential for a protracted conflict with its devastating consequences looms large. The legacy of this war will be felt for generations to come. It will reshape the geopolitical landscape of Europe, redefine relationships between nations, and leave an enduring mark on the collective consciousness of humanity. The world must learn from the mistakes that led to this conflict and strive to build a future where dialogue, diplomacy, and respect for international law prevail over aggression and violence. The war in Ukraine is a stark reminder that peace is a fragile and precious commodity, one that must be cherished, nurtured, and defended at all costs. It is a call to action, for leaders, policymakers and citizens alike to work tirelessly towards a world where such conflicts are consigned to the history books.